The wind cut sharp across the prairie, carrying with it the smell of dust and sage. The lonely ranch stretched for miles, empty but for the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the creak of a weathered windmill that never seemed to stop. For 15 years, the rancher had lived like this, alone, working from dawn until long after the stars had risen, his only company the wide, unforgiving land. His hands were rough from years of labor, his eyes tired from watching horizons with no one waiting at home. He hadn't touched a woman in all that time, hadn't spoken words softer than orders to hired help or greetings in town. His heart had hardened into silence, his life into rhythm. One morning, as the sun burned gold over the hills, a stagecoach stopped at the end of his long dirt road. He wasn't expecting supplies. He wasn't expecting anyone. But when the dust cleared, a young woman stepped down with a carpetbag in her hand and fear in her eyes. She looked around like she had been dropped into a foreign world, clutching a folded paper in her hand as though it held her only anchor. "You must be Mr. Calder," she said, her voice trembling, though she tried to hold it steady. He narrowed his eyes, adjusting his hat. "I am. Who might you be?" She swallowed, glancing at the coach that was already rolling away, the driver indifferent to her fate. "Your bride," she said. "At least, I was told I was coming here to marry you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy as the open plains. He hadn't sent for a bride. He hadn't written letters or paid any service. Yet here she was, standing in his yard, her face flushed with both embarrassment and hope. He felt something stir in him he thought long dead. Still, he crossed his arms. There must be some mistake. Her shoulders sank. "The agency in St. Louis gave me this address. They said the rancher here needed a wife. He should have sent her back on the next coach. He should have told her she was wasting her time. But instead, he found himself studying her worn shoes, her travel-weary face, the way her eyes searched his for an ounce of kindness. She wasn't pampered, that much was clear. Life had carved its marks on her too, and she carried herself with a quiet strength. "Come inside," he said finally, against his better judgment. "You can rest here, till we sort this out." She followed him into the cabin. The place was clean but bare, smelling faintly of wood smoke and leather. She set her bag down, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. He busied himself with the kettle, though he rarely offered hospitality to anyone. She sat at the small wooden table, staring at the steam rising from her cup as though she were afraid to look at him. "You came all this way for a man you'd never met?" he asked at last. Her lips quivered, but she lifted her chin. "There was nothing left for me back east. My family is gone. I needed something, a chance. And the letter said this man wanted a wife. I thought, maybe it was God's way of giving me a home." Her words struck deeper than he cared to admit. For 15 years, he had shut himself off from any thought of companionship, telling himself it was safer to keep the past buried. His late wife had died young, and with her, all his tenderness had gone into the ground. Yet here was a woman who had crossed half the country, believing she was meant for him. The days stretched into weeks as he tried to find a way to send word to the agency. The coach came irregularly, sometimes not at all. And in the meantime, she stayed. She rose early, helping with chores without being asked, her skirts gathering dust as she mended fences alongside him or carried water from the well. She cooked in the evenings, and the cabin slowly began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he owed her no more than kindness until she could be sent back. But each night, when she sang softly to herself as she worked by the fire, he felt something thawing inside him. A warmth he had forgotten, a hunger he had long denied. One evening, after a storm had rolled through and left the earth smelling of rain, they sat together in silence. She had braided her hair back, and a loose strand fell against her cheek. His hand itched to brush it away, but he clenched his fist instead. He hadn't touched a woman in 15 years. He didn't trust himself to remember how. But then she looked at him, her eyes filled with a softness he hadn't seen in so long it nearly broke him. "I know I wasn't meant to come here," she whispered. "But if you'll have me, I could make a life here. With you." The words cracked something open inside him. All the loneliness, the buried grief, the years of silence, they poured out in a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Slowly, as though afraid the moment might vanish, he reached out and let his fingers graze hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, She turned her hand over, pressing her palm against his, sealing something unspoken between them. The mistake that had brought her there no longer mattered. The land was vast, the nights long, and two souls who had nothing left in the world but each other found themselves bound not by accident, but by something far deeper. The first night after she spoke those words, the rancher hardly slept. The storm had passed, but something inside him churned heavier than any thunder. He lay in his bed, staring at the wooden beams above, listening to the faint creak of the house settling against the wind. From the other room came the soft sound of her shifting beneath the quilt he had given her, the one that had belonged to his late wife. For years, it had been folded in a trunk, gathering dust, carrying the scent of memories he had refused to touch. Now it covered another woman, one who had entered his life by mistake, and yet he could not bring himself to regret it. Each morning was a test of his resolve. He rose before dawn, as always, pulling on his boots and hat, stepping into the chill air to begin his chores. But now, when he returned, the cabin glowed with a warmth he hadn't known in years. She had a way of filling the silence, not with endless chatter, but with presence. She sang sometimes as she cooked, soft hymns or old folk tunes that carried across the yard when the window was open. Other times she asked questions about the land, about cattle, about the way storms rolled in across the plains. Her curiosity reminded him that this place, which had become little more than labor and solitude to him, still held wonder for someone seeing it fresh. One morning, he found her kneeling by the corral, her skirt dragging in the dust as she reached her hand toward a calf that had slipped under the fence. The animal bleated nervously, but she coaxed it back with patience, guiding it with gentle persistence until it rejoined its mother. She looked up at him then, her face flushed from the sun, and for the first time in years, he felt the twitch of a smile tug at his mouth. "You handle cattle better than most hands have hired," he said. She laughed lightly, brushing dust from her apron. "I've never touched one before today. Maybe it just knew I wasn't going to hurt it." Her words struck something deeper than she realized. For 15 years, he had lived with the weight of hurt, keeping everyone at arm's length. But she, this stranger, was showing him what it meant to touch life again without fear of breaking it. As weeks passed, the question of sending her back grew heavier. Each time the stagecoach rumbled in the distance, he found reasons not to ride into town. He told himself the agency had made the mistake, not him, and it was their duty to fix it. But truthfully, he was no longer sure he wanted it fixed. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The meals were no longer silent affairs. And when the long days ended, he found himself looking forward to her voice, her presence, her nearness. One evening, they worked side by side in the barn, stacking bales of hay before the night settled fully. The lantern flickered, casting warm light across her face. She paused, brushing loose strands of hair from her forehead, and he felt that same urge to reach out, to touch what was so close. Instead, he gripped the twine of the bale tighter. "You work harder than I expected you would," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. She looked at him, eyes searching. "I don't want to be a burden. I came here thinking I'd belong. Even if it wasn't meant to be, I can still pull my weight." He swallowed hard, turning away. "You're no burden." The truth was, she was the opposite. She was a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Yet he still wrestled with guilt. His late wife's shadow loomed over everything, her laughter that once filled the rooms, her touch that once softened his hard edges. He had buried those memories so deep, he thought they'd never resurface. But now they clashed with the new stirrings in his chest, confusing him, leaving him restless. One night, the guilt became too heavy. He sat outside beneath the stars, staring across the wide plains. The sky stretched endlessly, a black canvas filled with silver. He felt her before he heard her footsteps. She came quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and sat beside him. "You think too much," she whispered. His jaw tightened. "I'm not a man who thinks enough, maybe. Not about the right things." She tilted her head, watching him. "You've been alone a long time." He nodded, not trusting his voice. "You're not the only one," she said softly. "I didn't just come out here because of some letter. I came because I was empty too. Alone in a city where no one knew my name, no one cared if I stayed or left. I thought maybe, if I gave myself to someone who needed me, I'd find a reason to keep going." He turned to look at her then, the lantern light from the cabin window faintly touching her face. There was no deceit in her words, no pretense. Just a woman stripped bare by honesty. He felt his throat tighten. Slowly, as though fighting a force greater than himself, he reached out and let his fingers brush the edge of her shawl. She didn't move away. That small touch broke 15 years of silence between his heart and his body. He felt her nearness in a way that stole his breath. He wanted more, but he held back, afraid of rushing what had taken so long to bloom. Days turned into months. The townsfolk began to talk when they came in for supplies together. Whispers followed them down the street, how the lonely rancher had taken in a woman by accident, how she stayed anyway. Some looked with suspicion, others with approval. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Winter came, harsh and unrelenting. Snow blanketed the land, cutting them off for weeks at a time. Yet those days, shut inside together, were the sweetest he had known. She sewed by the fire while he mended tools. They spoke in low voices, sharing stories of their pasts. She told him of her childhood, of loss and longing. He told her, haltingly, about his wife, about the emptiness that had ruled him since. She listened, not with pity, but with understanding. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she placed her hand over his. "You don't dishonor her by living again," she said. "You honor her by remembering love at all." The words unraveled him. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to hold a woman close. She fit against him as though she had always belonged there, her head resting against his chest, her breath warming the cold places inside him. From that night forward, something shifted. The touches became more frequent, his hand guiding hers as they worked, her fingers brushing his sleeve as she passed. Each one sparked a fire that grew harder to contain. Until one night, when the storm outside howled so fiercely the cabin shook, they gave in fully. He kissed her, tentative at first, as though testing if the world would break around him. But she kissed him back with a hunger that answered years of silence. His hands trembled as they cupped her face, as though rediscovering a language long forgotten. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the warmth of her body pressed against his, the promise of life returning. Afterward, lying together in the quiet glow of dying embers, he felt a peace he had thought forever lost. She traced circles on his chest, and he realized that the mistake that had brought her to his door was no mistake at all. Spring came, thawing the land and their hearts alike. They worked the ranch as partners, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Neighbors began to visit, bringing congratulations once they saw what had blossomed. Some still whispered about how it began, but neither of them cared. What mattered was the life they had built, not out of planning, but out of grace. One afternoon, as they rode out to check the herd, she turned in the saddle and smiled at him. "Do you ever think about how strange it is that I wasn't supposed to come here?" He looked at her, the sun casting a halo around her face. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes what we call a mistake is the only thing that saves us." And in that moment, with the land stretching wide and endless around them, he knew the lonely years were over.